This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 18th chapter. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. And let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When it is just me out in the world, I enjoy people watching. But if I am working or out making visits, I love talking with people, mostly because you never know who you might meet. I once did a wedding for a guy who flew with Chuck Yeager in World War II. Another time, I met a woman who was at the St. Louis Cardinal game when Jackie Robinson stepped out on the field. I love talking with people because one never knows how small the world is until we begin sharing our stories, the places we've been, the people we know, the things that we have done. And then there are those awkward moments when you are minding your own business, not wanting to talk to anyone in particular, but a total stranger engages you in conversation, and you never know what might happen. Once, at an HEB in Corpus Christi, an older gentleman in his late 80s stopped to talk to me and shared with me stories about his father, who was part of a group of law enforcement officers that were perched on top of a bank building in far south Texas, waiting for none other than Pancho Villa and his gang. It was kind of cool. And then there is the random person in a store, but most often a plane, who is talking on and on about everything and absolutely nothing in particular. We all have those moments, or fear of those moments. And those places are the hardest places to be sometimes because we feel stuck. Stuck because we have stopped listening and connecting. All we want to do is escape. What I try to practice in those moments is this. I take a breath, a moment, and think, God has put this person on my path today, and my job right now is to figure out why. What do I have to learn from them? What can I learn about them or about life? Sometimes I figure that out. Other times I simply do not. And when that happens, my guess is that person just needed somebody to listen, somebody to make eye contact with them, somebody to pay attention to them because they were in a tough or lonely place in life. But isn't that what life is all about? Talking with and learning from each other, connecting and growing together. If it is not, then maybe it should be, because then there would be a lot less us versus them issues in the news, on our social media platforms, and in our lives. I want us to keep that idea that God puts other people in our lives to help us grow, that we are to listen, connect, and to learn from each other, and that when we fail to do those things, we dissolve into a society of us versus them. And keeping all that in mind, I now want to invite us into the gospel passage this morning about a Pharisee and a tax collector, into a story that feels a lot like it's an us and them in terms of who is better at practicing their faith. But what the story is really about is the we, and what we can learn from each other as we grow as a community of believers and grow in our spiritual practices as well. Our text from Luke's gospel is a parable that Jesus told to some who thought of themselves as righteous, that would be the us, and thought of others with contempt, that would be the them. And this is that parable according to the Message translation. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax man. The Pharisee posed and prayed like this: "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, crooks, adulterers, or heaven forbid, like this tax man. I fast twice a week and tithe all my income." Meanwhile, the tax man, slumped in the shadows, his face in his hands, not daring to look up, said, "God, give mercy. Forgive me, a sinner." Now, according to one person's reflection on this passage, the Pharisee offered his prayer based on what he learned in the Psalms, Psalm 17, verses 3 through 5. And it reads, "If you try my heart, if you visit me by night, if you test me, you will find no wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. As for what others do, by the word of your lips, I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped." Now, the tax man, too, prayed the Psalms, and his prayer was deep down in Psalm 51, verses 1 through 2, which reads, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." 2 men enter the temple. 2 men pray the Psalms. 2 men seek the grace of God. One reminded God of all that he had done right in comparison to the other man, and the other man owned his sin. Jesus commented, "This tax man, not the other, went home made right with God. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself." I like that Message translation. Hear it again. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself. Or as the translation we read earlier puts it, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted." Our lesson to learn is humbleness. But what we struggle with is our humanity and our better than comparisons with each other. Our passage from Luke is offering us a lesson in how to grow in our spiritual maturity as a disciple of Jesus. Sometimes we, like the Pharisee, trust in ourselves rather than God. We like to celebrate all that we do. We think that God's grace is earned, and we've done an excellent job of earning it, far better than so-and-so, if we must say so ourselves. Sometimes we, like the tax collector, know exactly where and how we have failed to live fully into who it is God calls us to be, and we long for a redo, a second, or even a third chance. But the truth is, we could learn a lot from each other. And if we did, I wonder how it would change things. That parable might instead read like this. 2 men enter the temple. 2 men pray the Psalms. 2 men seek the grace of God. Having learned from the other, the Pharisee slumped to his knees and buried his face in his hands, asking God for mercy. The tax man offered his prayers of thanksgiving for his change of heart, for the change in himself about how he conducted business, and then he made an offering to God out of the generosity of his heart. Both men learned from each other and relied on God's grace as they changed their lives. Growth in our spiritual journey as disciples of Jesus is part of our process. We learn how to grow with and from each other as we share our stories and learn from each other. For the last 2.5 months here at Faith, we have been practicing sharing our stories. Faith in action, we call them. We have heard from those of you involved in the ministries of the church, from Faith House to Grace Place to the Blood Drive to Godly Play, to name a few. We heard about the nuts and bolts about that ministry area, but we also heard some impact stories about how lives are touched and changed by what we do together here at Faith. And for the last 4 weeks, we have shifted the focus of those faith in action stories to personal stories about spiritual growth and generosity. Faith in action in a deeply personal way, if you will. Doug Elson and Barbara McDowell shared their stories about how they have learned how to grow in generosity. And we heard from Michelle, a Faith House guest and the mother, who shared with us her personal experience about being on the receiving end of faith's generosity. Every week, you have been receiving that bulletin insert with a reflection, challenge, and biblical grounding to help you grow in your spiritual practice of generosity. We've even invited you during the context of worship to talk about where you've seen or experienced generosity in your own lives. Today is the culmination of all that we have learned about how to build a culture of generosity here at Faith by growing in our own knowledge about how we practice and teach and learn from each other as we grow in response to God's presence and our awareness of the many blessings in our lives. I have learned that it has been a while since this type of annual appeal has been done here at Faith, and that is why we have been very intentional about the educational pieces of it. It is our hope that you have been inspired by the stories shared and the ministries celebrated. Your church is not the church it was 7 months ago or even 2 years ago. And your future here is exciting to think about. This past week in the mail, you received a letter and a card of intent to fill out as you prayerfully consider your generosity in giving to the ministry and mission of Faith. If you have forgotten your card or did not receive one, we do have extras on the table in back of church. And in just a bit, after the choir sings, I'm going to invite you forward to bring your cards of intent and to offer them as a gift to God. But I would also invite us to consider that moment to be one in which we are practicing what we have learned from hearing other people's stories of generosity, or from witnessing the way that those who helped shape our faith practiced their generosity. All the while, we are a bit more aware that we are teaching others because we learn how to be generous from each other. Amen.